Hello, I'm Richard Squires. Stephen Eisner's story was recorded during his LifeStory interviews. I wrote his memoir, and I hope you enjoy this video as much as I did creating his life story. What's your full name?
Stephen Alexander Eisner.
In Prague, your name wasn't Stephen, right?
Stepan. Over the P, there's a little V on top, which makes it that sound. In Prague, we had a house in the country, in a place, Klonovitz. Klonovitz is about a half-hour drive from Prague. We would go there on weekends. My parents had built a home there. Very nice building. It was a comfortable house, 2 stories. It was a major house in the country. I know the German army took it over and we just left it. My earliest memories are from Klonovitz. Going out into the garden, actually it was more of a woods than a garden. They'd search for me, bring me back and said, where were you, what were you doing? And I told him I was in the woods with the gypsies. I didn't see any gypsies, but I made that up.
What was the city of Prague like? What was your apartment like?
It was an apartment house. It wasn't a building. Very comfortable, very big. I remember best the dining room table, because we'd go there, and there were pictures of the relatives, grandfathers on the wall. Tommy and I had a nurse that slept in the big bedroom that we had an alcove. That was her sleeping place. She was a blonde Slovakian, and I would wake up before she got up and stay in bed and watch her get dressed. I forget how old I was. I was 3 or 4 years old, something like that. That's the fondest memory that I have of Prague. Prague was really bilingual, Czech and German. And but with the Slečna, we just spoke Czech.
Slečna?
Slečna.
What's that?
Servant.
You're the Fräulein?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me about your mother, early memories.
A very gentle person. She was in the store with my father, but the store was within walking distance. Whenever we came home from school, she was there. She was always with us. She spoke German. She was Austrian. So basically that's why we were bilingual, Tommy and I. German, Czech, later on also Latin. She was also a very active person. Skied with us, played tennis. We went to Switzerland, St. Moritz. That's where I broke my leg. Mom and Dad were skiing, and Tommy and I went sledding. And I wanted to get on the front of the sled. And when we were going downhill, we went over a bump, and I fell forward, and he couldn't turn the sled around. The sled ran over me and broke the leg.
But how old were you when you had the accident?
About 4. Too young to ski, and that's why I was sledding. And my father and mother immediately came over, and I went to the hospital. My grandmother came immediately. Within a day, she was in the hospital with a suitcase of my toys with her. I guess the way they set a leg that was broken in those days was you put him up in there on a pulley. I don't know what it did at night, but all the pictures of me in the hospital with the leg up in the air like that. It was the left leg. Ever since then, my left leg is longer than my right leg. About an inch difference now. I was in the hospital a couple of weeks, I guess for 2 weeks or something like that. Then we came back to Prague.
Tell me about your dad.
He was very gregarious.
What was his name?
Robert Benjamin Eisner. He was very generous and humorous, a lot of friends. He was very attentive to us. His brothers were officers in the Czech army, in the cavalry. That's why I started riding, and he was a good horseback rider. He was the one who started us on skiing. He also played tennis. He built a very successful store, women's wear. There was a big sign outside, Štihla matka tlustacera proti šaty u Eisnera. A slender mother, stout daughter, buy their clothing at Eisner's. Prague itself, at that time, was not very large. The store was in the area around what here would be called Times Square. The Czech army went through the Times Square. They had a cavalry that showed off. It took them 2 hours to go through, and we watched from the store. They never fired a shot. They surrendered. Then 2 weeks later, we were up there again to watch the German army coming in. And they came through in the other direction. It took them all day. Tanks rolling through there and so on. When we left Prague, the store stayed behind, and we never got anything back from it. He spoke Czech, German, English. He had been in England before on his own, working there in some kind of a garment industry. So he spoke English. And when we left Czechoslovakia, he was already in England because he had been drafted back into the army, and then the army just folded. The ones who got advance notice were the Jewish officers. And so when we left in '39, that's where we went. I was 7 years old, but we applied for a visa to get out. And my uncle was a counselor to the financial minister. And he had the connections to get us visas. My mother packed us up, and we went on a train, and the Gestapo came through the train. Everybody had to show them their visa. My mother is a Christian, and so her visa was Christian, but we were not on that visa. We would have been on there as Jewish children. We were in the dining car, and one of the waiters came and talked to my mother and so on, and the waiter took Tommy and I into the kitchen car. They took us into a pantry where we would peel potatoes. You know, they kept us busy. A couple of the cooks kept us company. When the Gestapo came in, the dining car was uncoupled from the kitchen car, and the kitchen car was dragged over to some other part of the railroad stop. So they were totally separated, and my mother didn't know that. She would not have bribed us into the kitchen if she knew that the car would be uncoupled, that we might never see each other again. It just so happened that we coupled up again. And I didn't learn that until a long time later in England. That was the way she got us out of Czechoslovakia. We went to, I guess Holland it was, and got across the channel, and my father met us at the port. And we hadn't seen him for a couple of months. Went to London. We were there for 2 years, from 1939 to 1941, while the Blitz was on, the London Blitz. England had not declared war on Germany when we traveled there, but a couple of weeks later they declared war. We lived in Wessex Gardens, which is Golders Green. It was bombed with incendiary bombs, burn up the houses. It was all nighttime bombing, and we would go into the underground every night when the alarm sounded. I was enrolled in the Catholic school, La Sagesse Convent, and Tommy was sent to a private school. We would talk Czech to each other, and the only way that we would learn English quickly is if we just spoke English. Well, I didn't speak any English, but I learned quickly. because I didn't have Tommy to talk to. I would walk to school by myself, and the first time I brought a report card back, it said, "Stephen is late every day." He said, "What do you, why don't you go on time?" I said, "Well, I go different ways because the streets are blocked with what happened at night. You know, some houses were still smoking and streets were shut. And so that's why I'm late." I would get the shrapnel, and we would all compare the shrapnel that we got, and I took my time because I didn't have anything else to do, so I got the most shrapnel. But the shrapnel was all over the place.
Tell me about leaving England.
The Andalusia Star was a passenger boat, and there were about 30 passengers on it. This was a blockade runner from England to Argentina to pick up beef. They come back with meat. I think 4 or 5 of us as children. The others were all adults. We would go on the deck during the day and help the sailors, the staff, like help look for the periscopes. 1941 was the height of the U-boat massacre. There were 50 caliber machine guns fore and aft in case the submarine ever surfaced. And the route was up to Greenland and then lay off the coast of Greenland until you got a clearance to run the blockade. England had by that time solved the enigma, and they waited until they got the signal, make the run for it, did it, either made it or not. And the word was that if we were sunk, if the boat got hit and we had to go into the water, 3 or 4 minutes. It's cold, so on, and you don't have time to get into the lifeboats. I guess sometime Arlene and I were in Australia on vacation, and we went to a place called Ayers Rock. It's in northern Australia, in a vast desert. The only other couple on the bus that day was a British gentleman who I eventually got to talking with. He said that he was in the Blue Star Line. I said, "Blue Star Line, really? Did you ever get on the Andalusia Star?" He said, "No. She sank just before I got there." And that always stayed with me, at not going into the cold water. And that was how we came to America. We got down to Argentina. We transferred to a cruiser and to an American line, and a couple of days later we got off the boat in New York. Well, we spoke English, but with very strong British accents. We were here for a couple of weeks, and then we went to Grand Rapids, where Mother had some relatives. We stayed in Grand Rapids for 2 years. My father opened another store there, but it was never as successful as his first one. Tommy and I integrated pretty well with friends. At school, I went to St. Thomas. These were all Catholic schools that I had been in. My parents never really integrated with the Michigan culture, so we came back to New York. My Uncle Paul, who had been the counselor to the finance minister, eventually got visas for my grandfather and grandmother. They went to Lisbon, Portugal, from Portugal to Cuba, and in Cuba applied for a visa to get into the United States. But they couldn't get the visa for some reason. You had to give evidence that you would not be a burden. The State Department was anti-Semitic. They didn't want any more Jews coming in, and it was very hard for Jewish people to get a visa. My grandmother got a hold of a dictionary, English dictionary, and wrote Eleanor Roosevelt a letter about who they are, and we just want to see our children, and that's all we want. She addressed that letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, White House, Washington. Mrs. Roosevelt delivered that to the, I don't know how she did it. She called somebody in the State Department and said, look, why can't these people come in here? She got them out of Cuba right away, and they got a visa through the intervention of Eleanor Roosevelt. And then when they came here, they wrote Mrs. Roosevelt a thank you letter, and she invited us to tea. She lived in an apartment on Washington Square at that time. She was a very wonderful lady. My parents couldn't be more proud. I was in high school, in Forest Hills High School, from 1904 to 48. From 48, when I graduated from high school, I went to Anchorage, to Elmendorf Air Force Base, because I was working for the government. I was in the engineer corps and they were surveying Kiska, the islands off the coast of Alaska. From Elmendorf Air Force Base down to Kiska was very beautiful, a beautiful island. It was very interesting work. I liked surveying, I liked that, but I couldn't make any money. And I heard that they were building a railroad from Anchorage to Fairbanks. And I got a job on the railroad crew. The crew was about 130 men, and we all slept in the railroad cars. The native Indians were sort of a token group of these 130. Everybody got along fine, and I liked it. I got into the survey part of that because at that point the railroad was in Denali Park, which was then called McKinley. The pay was good because there was daylight all day long. There was no, well, it's sundown, it's dark. You can't survey in the dark. We could work until 10 o'clock at night, which we would do sometimes. It was work, work, work. And I came back from Alaska with a bag full of money. I started at NYU, but I was a lousy student, and I didn't like it, and I was stuttering very badly. Somebody had recommended me to a psychoanalyst, who turned out to be very good. He said, well, what do you want to do? I said, I'd like to go skiing to Aspen for the winter. He said, why don't you do that? I can do that? He said, yeah, you can do that. You'll get enough money to get a train ride out there or a plane. And I had a letter from him to somebody in Aspen, a cable company, that Steve Eisner is a good skier and he'd like to be on the patrol. I left school. I was halfway through my senior year, but I knew the marks would be very disappointing. I just was very unhappy. So I got to Aspen right away, went to this gentleman, showed him the letter. He said, yeah, you can get on the packing crew. I didn't ski well enough to be a ski crew, but on the packing crew was good. For the first couple of weeks, the only time I skied was with a shovel, because we had to open the trail. We would ski down to there, and then we'd shovel it out and shovel it back in, to take out the moguls and that. And I like doing that. When you're skiing with a shovel, it makes certain demands on you. It's easier to go back to 2 poles. At the end, I was skiing very well. It paid a little bit, but at night I worked in the Golden Horn. The Golden Horn is owned by Steve Knowlton. And so I worked as a busboy, but got promoted to waiter very quickly. I made more money as a waiter than I did on the packing crew. I stayed there the whole winter and into spring. There was a draft in '51. I wanted to go into the Army. I didn't want to go back to school. Friedel Pfeiffer, who was the head of the ski school at Aspen, he was a 10th Mountain Division. I wanted to go into 10th Mountain. And I wrote a letter to the 10th Mountain Division, come and get me. But they replied, no, the Army no longer does that. I had been to Tuckerman's Ravine. It's a ski area that's totally different from any other. Nothing like it. You climb up in boots, not in ski boots. And you get up to the bottom of the ravine, and there are the shelters. Well, you can do it under an hour, but you got to be good. It's a real steep hike. You put your skis on there, then you climb up as far as you want to go. And you can drop off at various places. Most of us climb up the ravine, stop short of the top, put our skis on and start going down.
So when you went there, you lived in this cabin, this lean-to, for how long?
A little over a month.
Basically camping out.
Yeah, camping out. And, you know, I would have stayed longer, but my mail came. Greetings, please report to Fort Dix in New Jersey in the topographic department, because my job had been as a surveyor. I took the letter, went home, showed it to my mother and father, and packed a knapsack, I guess, and that was it. I wanted to go to Korea. I wanted to get into the action. That's why I enlisted. I didn't enlist to be a teacher. He said, no, I can't do that. I stutter. He totally dismissed that. The Army wasn't going to listen to what I wanted to do. I thought, well, if I stutter so badly, they'll move me out. But actually, I didn't. I could teach it pretty well. The first couple of weeks we were learning what we would be teaching. The students that were selected to continue were sent to charm school. You know, how do you address a crowd? You're the one that has to stare into the sun if you're outside. If there was wind blowing, it was going to blow into your face, not into their face. I think charm school was maybe a week or so. Then I was assigned to a fort, which was Fort Belvoir.
So let me ask you, the story about your mother showing up at the base.
When I was home, I had a furlough for a week or so. We discussed what I would do further on and what the possibilities were. And well, one of them is officers candidate school, but I don't want to do that. I want to go to Korea. My mother was shocked in my preference. But they drove me back to Fort Belvoir. Next day, when we're lining up, I was called out to see the
general.
Yeah, this officer. He would select the ones who would go to officers training school. I asked the officer who I reported to, how am I selected? He said, well, your mother was here and talked to me, and he says, she told me this and that about you. And I said, yeah, that's true. He said, okay, you don't have to take it. You can go back to being a private. When my mother heard that I was now a private, what's going on? Well, I told her, and she was very upset by that. The lodge at the bottom of Tuckerman's Ravine, Pinkham Notch, was owned and run by the Dodge family. Brooks Dodge was an Olympic skier. He was on several of the United States Olympic teams. He was very good. One day, I see the name Brooks Dodge on the list of students who were coming in. I recognized him right away. I introduced myself, complimented him on his skiing. I said, every now and then I get to go skiing from here. In Virginia, they didn't know about skiing. But I told the sergeant or whoever that you got Brooks Dodge here. He's a major American athlete. Don't waste his time with the rest of us. So Brookie got immediately upgraded to doing something else. And because I got him out of kitchen police and that kind of stuff, when I went to Pinkham Notch after that, they were very nice to me. I was transferred to the artillery. When you had a cannon or any missile, you had to point it in a direction. That would be the azimuth, from the point that you were on to the point where the missile should go. And that was topography. That was done from different maps. And one of the more interesting thing was that the maps that the Army had at the time were based on calculations that had been done in 1866. And that was updated periodically by the Army. But in 1952, World War II was over, and one of the things that the Army got was the German calculations for azimuths. They were using a different sphere. We had our choice which sphere to use. More often than not, we used the German maps. I was assigned to a unit, and we would take the equipment, and they would know how to load the cannons and so on, and I would know how to point them. 2 years later, I was discharged, an honorable discharge as Sergeant Stephen Eisner. I loved being in the Army. There was always something to do, and it was constructive. From the Army, I went back to NYU. Instead of the class of 1952, I was the class of 1955. As a civil engineer, but I didn't enjoy working on a board all day long, drawing up plans and correcting them, not correcting them. What I wanted to do is get out into the construction end of it, and that was very successful. The company that I ended up with was Diesel Construction Company, which was the start of construction management in New York, high-rise buildings. Pan Am building was a diesel construction project. That was my first job. The building was redesigned a number of times. It was sliced down. This is already a very busy part of town. We don't need another couple of 100,000 people there just so you can collect rent. This building is over Grand Central, and a lot of the work had to do with the foundation, which went down between the trains and the basement and the sub-basement. It was Grand Central. Trains kept on running, and looking at plans and digging here, not in the middle of the tracks, that kind of thing. There was a regulation that buildings would not have signs, advertisements, especially not in neon, over the avenues. So what Mr. Morse did, Mr. Morse was the owner of Diesel Construction, put it on very faint, and then slowly over a couple of months, it got louder, from very dark to there it is. And nobody was complaining. Then I went on to other buildings. The combination of reading plans that were drawn up and then writing contracts that should be fulfilled, I like that. I worked for diesel construction for 15 years. Became vice president. Then I left that and started my own business. What I didn't like about that was I'd always be selling myself. I didn't want to do that. I'm going to buy you. I don't want to sell myself. I left that and went to work for a developer who was his own construction manager. That was Rockrose. That was wonderful. I loved every minute of it. They were a great family to work for. I started out by supervising the construction of offices in the office buildings that they owned. They rented something, they got plans to what to build there, and I started doing that. The assembly of buildings really cheered me up. That's how I like doing it. A great deal of my work was the foundation of the building, where you dig out the earth and build a foundation. And what do you do with the stuff that you dig up? There weren't the regulations when I was building that there are now, which is the correct thing. I hate to say some of the things that we did, which we wouldn't do if we had to do it now. Not dangerous, but certainly nothing that helped the environment. That was what I did for 30-some years. So now with 15 years and 32 and myself, I had 50 years of construction. When I finally retired from that, the industry had changed quite a bit in that period. If I had to do it over again, I would work in the environmental field.
So what year did you build the house in Stowe?
65, something like that.
You were doing pretty well in business. You could
Oh, yeah.
afford a house.
Well, there was a log cabin, vertical logs, not horizontal, because I didn't like the way that they weathered. I liked the way that tree grows this way, it should work that way. There are very few of these vertical log cabins. I bought a kit from a firm in Michigan, and they showed up with a truckload of logs. About 3 weeks later, there was a finished cabin.
Did friends help you?
Not in building it, but they helped me in coming up on weekends. I bought a horse.
What was the name of the horse?
Mumps, because it had a huge head. I had several horses over the years. I enjoyed grooming the horse. You go all around the four hoofs, you pick them up and clean them up, brush them down and so on. It was common to talk to the horses. People talk differently. They say, nice boy, nice boy. And I didn't do that. I talked to him what I wanted to say to somebody, because I stuttered pretty badly through those periods. I would tell him, you know what happened to me this morning? That happened to me. You know what I'm going to do to that guy? Yeah. And I didn't stutter when I was doing that, when I was grooming. The riding that I did was a fox hunt. I joined a fox hunt, the Green Mountain fox hunt, got my colors in it eventually and went riding. 10 or 15 hounds out there and 20 horsemen. The hounds were the only thing that we were following, and they were supposedly hounding down a scent. We would purchase some fox urine. One rider would ride out ahead of everybody else dragging the sack. And so the hounds would follow that scent, and over a fence and around trees and so on. And he would pick a trail that you would enjoy riding. We never saw a fox. And I would never ride in a live fox hunt. I just wouldn't want to do that.
Were you a big shot up at Stowe?
No.
You were a popular guy?
Well, they picked me for that film, Bunnies, Bachelors, and Broken Bones.
the skier, the real romance of skiing is deeper and more compelling. It's a force which brings an expert skier like Steve Eisner on the left to Stowe every weekend during the skiing season. Steve, who works for a construction company in New York City, has built a house in Stowe for weekends. But his real investment in skiing is more emotional than financial.
My feeling is the best thing I ever did was learn how to ski, and the second best thing I ever did was learn how to ski well. It gets better as you go along. If there is such a thing, I'm a compulsive skier. I'll ski anytime, any place. And when you're just skiing along and you're moving, and this is the beauty of it, there's really no place you would rather be. There's nothing you would rather be doing. You're hanging right on your edges and the speed is greater, and you're changing and you're turning, and the turns come quicker. And there's always that one challenge, one step ahead, and you're right on the brink of it. And the physical thing is that this is what you're working with for 10, 15 minutes, or maybe an hour. Your mind is a blank, and it's coping with just one thing, a foot of trail ahead of you. Concentrate on the wide sweep of a turn, just hang on the edge, just the balance. The wide turn, and you just let it go, and you just hang there on the edge, and you just hold it for a little bit longer and a little bit longer. Sometimes you're really in the rhythm of it. You can do no wrong. I've never broken a leg, but I might very well. I don't expect it to be fatal. I don't expect it to be traumatic. I expect to get it, and I expect to grin, bear it, and come back for more.
To the real skier, like Steve Eisner, there is only one reason for snow, for mountains, for ski resorts: to achieve the physical poetry fused from motion and speed that make all the risks and discomforts and costs worthwhile.
In '67, I broke my leg. There was a lot of breakage going on. By the following winter, I was back on skis. There were much better skiers than I on that film. The guys from the patrol and so on, they were really the stars of it, but I was one of the civilians. When they took the film, we said, "No, you're going to sign this, and you're going to get a royalty every year." For 2 years, I got $1 a year.
What does the bunnies refer to?
The beginning skiers, and then bachelors, like I was.
Was it a good bachelor scene?
No, not particularly. I didn't get married from up there.
No.
No.
So how did you meet Arlene?
A friend of mine showed me a picture of her in women's wear. She was interviewed because she was a fashion director at Kaiser Roth in stockings. Introduced me to her. We got along very well, and we dated for a couple of months, and we stopped, and we started dating again, stopped. We skied together in the winter. I took her to Central Park. We went riding, and we would date on and off. And then one day she said to me something to the effect of, "This shit has got to cease. We're not going to just date and stop." And I said, "No." I thought about it for about half a minute. I said, "Let's get married." We decided to get married immediately. Not tell everyone, not send out any notices, nothing like that. Went to City Hall, we got a license to get married. We went to Elkton, Maryland, where there were friends of Arlene's. I said, "What are you doing here?" "Well, we're down here to get married. You want to witness?" "Yeah, sure." So we went to the courthouse in Elkton. We looked at the parking lot. There were the parking spaces with the judges' names on them. And we picked a Jewish judge, either Cohn or Epstein or something like that. We went inside, and sure enough, he was there. We waited about an hour or something like that. They looked through the papers, the license we brought, and we got married. Went back in the car and started driving home. We called my mother, She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm on the Union Turnpike with Arlene." They had met Arlene by that time. I said, "What are you doing on the Union Turnpike?" He said, "Coming home. We just got married." Wow. She did not buy into that very easily.
So what year was it that you got married?
I always remember 1972 because I was 40 years old. We never did have a reception or anything like that, but we sent out the notices and stayed that way for 42 years. We bought a house up in Connecticut, a cottage, in a sort of a cottage community. For some reason, I got to be the president of the Homeowners Association. There was a lot of different opinions, the weekenders and the ones who were there year-round. So I agreed to become vice president. The president immediately retired, and now I was president. And a lot of time was spent on a lawsuit that the Homeowners Association had brought against the developer. People would talk to me, but they would also talk to Arlene and complain about this and that. And to get out of the Homeowners Association after 2 years of that, we moved to a much bigger house, very good house, up in Connecticut as well. It had just been built. And it's very beautiful. And she decorated that from start to finish. Designed the garden, and she was very good at that, things like that. I can't complain about anything she did. I miss her. We both wanted children. Boys. She wanted a girl, but that's all right. At that time, I was working on a building in Minneapolis. And I would go out there once a week, stay overnight, and come back next week to see what they had done. One day I came back from there. Arlene was playing tennis somewhere in Forest Hills. I stopped there. She came over and embraced me and then said, "Guess what?" So I found out about it on a tennis court.
So what was the experience of finally becoming a father? You had Andrew in '74.
Yeah. He's a very easy child. Both boys were always healthy. I spent time with them. No secrets or anything like that. Whatever they were doing, they would tell me about it. It's quality and quantity. You've got to spend time doing quality things. They were good company for me. Both of them loved to ski. They loved sports. Doug was... He was probably about 7 or 8. Kept talking about Bell Mountain. And I told him, "Well, we'll do it. We'll do it." One day, the day came, we skied from Ajax down to the Bell Mountain, just a little bit below the top of Aspen. And there was a sign. And Doug is looking at that. He could barely read. He had just learned to read. "Are we going down Bell Mountain?" I said, "Yeah, look over there." And he read that, and I read it to him, and then we started. And it was one of these days that had been powdery and snow. He did it perfectly. And we came out into Spar Gulch, and there was Arlene. That's my favorite memory in skiing. And his too, I think.
Yeah?
Yeah. Bell Mountain.
Yeah.
I can't think of a single time that any one of them caused trouble. When we went to school and talked to teachers, yeah, good. They should all be like that. Doug came to work in the company I was working with one summer, building real estate development. Based on that, when he went to college, he then went into real estate. That's what he's doing now very successfully. And Andrew was always the intellectual. He did very well. And now he's got his own business. He recommends music to advertising companies to complete their advertisements.
If you were going to give them a piece of advice as to how to live a full life, what would you say? How do you do it?
Don't change a thing that you're doing. You've been a credit to myself and Darlene from day one. You never caused us any trouble, only joy. Keep it up.
He lived in Chile for a time, right?
Yeah. When I went down to visit him, it was to go down to ski in Portillo in the Andes. I'm going out to get to his place, and the mountain is all zigzagged with ski trails in the powder. I asked the driver, there's a lot of skiing going on here. He says, no, it's just that one guy. It was Tommy. There was a veranda outside, and we'd go and eat breakfast on the veranda. You'd see skiers on the mountain facing it come down there. They weren't very good. The border ski patrol or something like that. They were being taught to ski down because they were going to be on the border, which is Stowe. They were all lined up, and somebody must have said, let's go. And they'll start toppling, and they would come down one by one. They'd fall. They were all over the place. And then one instructor would come down. But Chile was very good skiing. Tommy, my brother, he had bought a house in Taos. I went with him once or twice to Taos to ski, and it's difficult. Taos was always in the making, and that's what he liked about it. That was his favorite area. He was skiing down a trail which had been closed. He went early in the morning, and he was, I guess, amongst the first people down. It had a lot of moguls, and he was practicing going through the moguls. And I don't know what he did, but he went off one of the moguls, must have landed on his head and broke his neck. And eventually he was airborne out of there. He never recovered. We took him to Arizona, and that was it.
How old were you guys?
61.
So you were like 59?
Yeah, I'm 16 months younger.
Yeah.
I went to Israel after I retired. I was in Ben Gurion University, and I was in the Department of Hydrology. And I rented an apartment on the grounds of the university.
What town was this?
Is Debocare. And I had several jobs to do. One was go into the desert to the different wells, take samples and bring them back, and then take them into the lab and run them through a gyroscope, turn that over to the laboratory to determine the quality of the water. One of the problems with that was that each of these wells had a pump, but in the middle of the desert it was operated on a battery. The Bedouin people, that's how they got their batteries. They would take that, so I would have to go there and replace them. The desert is very beautiful. That part of the desert has got canyons in it, and the canyons have got caves, and you were driving along and somebody would come out of a cave. Israel was one of the first to stop the dismissal of trash or of toxic materials just into hole, because that would eventually drain into the water. There were different procedures that these rubbish fields had to comply with, and I would check that they were doing that the way they were supposed to.
And did you find it fulfilling?
Yeah, I liked doing that, and I liked Israel. Unfortunately, I didn't learn any words. Everybody there spoke English, but at the end of 6 months I came back, and I had really established what I wanted. I wanted to clear my head of everything. Arlene was very supportive of that. You want 6 months off? Try to write letters. Well, you know, and she came once to visit me. One of the things I did there was ski.
They have one ski mountain there?
Yeah, Mount Hermon. That was a very pleasant experience. I was astonished how good that mountain is. I didn't like being retired. So after a couple of months looking around, not doing anything, I worked at the PepsiCo building in Queens. And the deal was to remove the sign, keeping it totally intact, and put it into another building, which is where it is now. The area, I think it was 28 acres or something like that, was on the waterfront. The ground was leaking into the river that had to be stopped by driving steel sheeting into the ground. Foundation had to be dug, and from the foundations I would then also follow the superstructure. At any one time I would be doing 1 or 2 foundations at the same time as the superstructure was going up. At 9/11, I was on the 43rd floor of the State Building. We started the discussion, or whatever it was to be, at around 8:30 in the morning. All of a sudden, somebody came in and said, "Hey." So we had a straight look at the towers, and I saw them collapse. And I went home, and the next day, or maybe that afternoon, I went down to Wall Street and volunteered what to do. You know, I could read plans, and so what I worked on down there was manholes. You had to get into the manhole to turn on the water, turn it off, and so on. You had to find where the manhole was. There's no street. It's rubble. You couldn't start building a foundation without knowing where the pipes are coming from. On day 2, trucks started coming in with volunteers, guys who, and you took one look at them and you say, this is a construction worker, and immediately rushed into and started working, pulling stuff apart and cutting down. They were terrific. They would be there all day long. And I would go home at night. They would stay there and sleep over in one of the buildings that was still up. These were guys who did the thing. They got in there and they did it from the minute they got there. Wonderful. There was all kinds of asbestos in the air. Mostly we walked around with a mask or bandana. I would be there, and at the end of the day, I would get undressed outside the apartment. Arlene would put clothing for me out into the hallway, and I would change clothes and get on with things. Next day I went down there again, and I did that for about a week. After the week, I stopped going to Ground Zero, but I still help them with what is where. When I finally retired from that, I called up the mayor's office of environmental remediation. They have regulations which we had to abide by. that what you can build, what you can't build, what you can use, what you can't use. So I called them up. I said, I'd like to work for you. I'd like to do your end of the business. They didn't hire me. I volunteered. We weren't rich, but I had made enough money to do whatever I wanted. So as a volunteer, I had more freedom. I worked with them for 5 years. Then I retired again.